this morning. Well, listening to that is Kate Lester, the CEO of courier firm Diamond Logistics, which is based in Normandy near Guildford. Good morning to you, Kate. Thanks for joining us.
Morning, how are you?
I'm okay, thank you. Sounded pretty busy there in Huscombe, and you get a feel for what the people living there are dealing with, I suppose, if that's the right word to use. What's your reaction to what you heard there?
Well, I'm actually incredibly familiar with that area. My son was actually born within what is their proposed sort of exclusion zone. So I know it like the back of my hand. But I actually drove through it yesterday afternoon after I was approached by yourselves just to look at all the businesses that are actually inhabiting that triangle. And I guess my biggest problem is whilst they say that there will be an exclusion for vehicles that need to deliver, then how is it going to be policed? Because ultimately speaking, if they're driving goods off of larger vehicles and if they're going to put them onto more vehicles, you're going to have more 7.5 tonnes, which arguably cause almost as much impact as the 44-tonne lorries that they're talking about. And it's also going to drive up the local cost. There's an awful lot of farms in those areas as well. So they were talking about the livestock lorries that are going through. But again, if they're allowed to deliver and or collect, then those vehicles will be exempt from it anyway. So for me, it's just how do they police it, and how do we still let business and commerce within that triangle, building rural jobs and rural businesses, whilst, taking on board the needs of the local citizens as well.
Yeah, tricky one to balance there, because so many people do shop online now. So deliveries is a very real thing for people living and working in most of Surrey and the rest of the country. In terms of, you meant, I been hearing about the 7.5 tonnes in terms of that lorry, because that's what the proposal Surrey County Council are looking at, putting the restrictions on and around. I mean, that must be less than a 44-tonne impact.
Yes.
Sorry. I'm trying to visualise how big these things are.
Well, quite large. I think your previous interviewee was talking about the length of these 44-tonne vehicles, and she is considerably more expert on it than I am. But ultimately speaking, 7.5 tonnes aren't small vehicles, and I do think that they may well be a little bit more adaptable within these roads, and I acknowledge that. But if you're talking about kegs of beer being delivered to your pub, including the Merry Harriers and the White Horse within that triangle that I drove past yesterday, or plant hire companies that may well have trailers that they're putting large vehicles on, of which I saw one being delivered to a farm yesterday afternoon, or small industrial estates, you're going to make it almost impossible for people to do their jobs. And I don't know how you're going to be able to police it, and I also truly don't know if any HGV driver in his right mind that I have met in my 32 years experience in the logistics industry would use these teeny tiny roads unless they absolutely have to, because it's extraordinarily challenging for them. So I think they're doing it out of necessity rather than choosing it as a cut through. And in terms of geography, I think if they were coming down from Aberdeen, they wouldn't be cutting through Marwick Lane through to Cranley, by the way, either.
Well, it was interesting that was a different perspective there, and you're entitled to your opinion. But Sarah did paint a very visual picture, didn't she, of that narrow passing of those two vehicles. So, and you were there in the afternoon yesterday, and she was mentioning about how busy, obviously, in the rush hour in the morning. So it sounded pretty busy there this morning, and she also mentioned about Friday afternoons particularly. What was the state of the roads like when you were there? Because I think some concern being cited about congestion getting through, like we just mentioned, but also about the state of the roads and the impact these heavy vehicles have on them.
It was extraordinarily quiet, but there were deliveries on heavy goods vehicles being made throughout the roads that I was looking at. So there was a like a heavy goods vehicle that was delivering some farm equipment. That was on the Pickhurst lane. So, but it was relatively quiet, to be perfectly frank. And it's interesting, she talks about it being 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. And I guess people are consciously choosing a time whereby they're not impacting on school runs and or commuters. So I guess they're thinking that they're trying to be more amenable in terms of delivering early, so they don't, so that their vehicles aren't caught up in that kind of rush hour. But again, it's not taking into consideration the needs of all the road users, I think, rather than just the general public.
It's an interesting one, and we're really pleased to have your perspective on the programme. We are out of time. I just want to hear your thoughts on the people living there. And I mean, you say you know the area so well, you clearly do, citing the businesses, and you were there only yesterday. Do you have sympathy for people living there, dealing with the noise, with the impact, with the congestion?
I truly do, and particularly it's such a beautiful part of the world, the buildings there are all absolutely gorgeous. I look forward to moving back there one day, but ultimately speaking, I think we need, rather than this hierarchy of road users that we've got at the moment that puts HGVs at the bottom, we've got to take on board what HGVs contribute, and that is, cost-effective deliveries to rural areas, which means people get the goods that they want.
Good speaking to you this morning. That's Kate Lester, the CEO of Courier Firms.